Sehr geehrter
Dear Mr. Merz, ladies and gentlemen, dear guests, on behalf of the Körber Foundation, I would like to welcome you to the historic ballroom of the Hotel de Rome. Welcome to the first edition of our Körber Global Leaders Dialogue this year. A very warm welcome to our guest, Friedrich Merz, chairman of the CDU in Germany and chairman of the CDU CSU Parliamentary Group in the Bundestag. Welcome, Mr. Merz. Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in a time of fundamental upheaval, which is suitably described by the term global Zeitenwende, global turnaround. Liberal democracy, and with it the Western-style rule-based international order, is coming under increasing pressure. In a world where autocracies are on the rise, we are being challenged by forces that perceive our values and our way of life as a threat to their own power. However, our liberal democratic societies are also at risk of being undermined internally by political managers of fear and hatred, but also by the dwindling trust of citizens in the ability of politicians to find solutions. 3 days ago, Donald Trump was sworn in as the 47th President of the United States of America. Let's not fool ourselves. The Trump II administration will change the US as well as the transatlantic relationship and the West as a whole. But instead of lamenting or indulging in transatlantic nostalgia, we Europeans should explore convergences of interest with the new American administration and identify possible areas of cooperation in a self-confident, sober, united, and clear manner. Because there's truly no shortage of challenges that need to be mastered. Let me highlight one challenge in particular. 1 month from now, February 24th, 2025, will mark the 3rd anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a brutal war of aggression that has not only brought immeasurable suffering and destruction to Ukraine, but has literally reduced our European peace order to rubble. Especially these days, when there's so much discussion about the start of possible peace negotiations, one thing is particularly close to my heart. Of course, we all want peace, but there must not be peace at any price. That would not be just, but not just unjust, but above all, it would be a pseudo-peace that would not last. History has taught us that time and time again. In any case, we must not let up in our support for Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, the turbulence of a world characterized by geopolitical tension and deglobalization does not stop at Germany's borders. And I'm convinced if we want to preserve our security, prosperity, and freedom in the future, then we cannot withdraw to the sidelines of international politics. The latest poll in our annual foreign policy publication, The Berlin Pulse, you will find a copy in your seat, shows that almost 50% of Germans, that is 46%, and it is the highest figure since it was first published in 2017, are in favor of greater German involvement in international crises and conflicts. Almost the same number, that is 44% of citizens, however, are against a more internationally engaged Germany. All those in politics and civil society who are campaigning for more engagement and involvement of Germany, therefore, still have a lot of explaining to do. Ladies and gentlemen, the Körber Foundation has been dealing with central issues of German and European foreign policy for many years. Many of you are regular guests at our events. Many of you are familiar with the diplomatic endurance run of the daily Eat, Sleep, and Manage a Crisis, and we as a foundation are politically independent, but we are not apolitical. We initiate debates and Now, I would like to quote our former federal president and former chairman of the Bergedorf discussion group, Richard von Weizsäcker. I quote, "A training camp, we want to be a training camp for all those who are prepared to transcend the boundaries of their own discipline, parties, and interests in order to learn by confronting the diversity of experiences and perspectives of others," unquote. Dear Mr. Merz, thank you for joining our guests at this so-called training camp today. We look forward to your presentation and the subsequent discussion, which will be chaired by my colleague Nora Müller, head of our International Policy Department in Berlin. I would like to close, you will forgive me, Mr. Merz, with a quote of a great social democrat, Ferdinand Lassalle. He once said, I quote, "All great political action is based on saying what is and begins with that," unquote. Let us do just that today, say what is in international politics and think together about the foreign policy action that follows from it. Dear Mr. Merz, welcome again. You have the floor. Thank you.
Gerne, lassen Sie es einfach da stehen, so ist gut. Sehr geehrter
Mr. Paulsen, Mrs. Müller, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I'd like to thank the Körber Foundation for having organized today's event. I am particularly grateful to have the opportunity today to discuss a few fundamental issues related to our common foreign and security policy. Mr. Paulsen, you already said it. It is no coincidence that we are meeting here today, because 3 days ago in Washington, D.C., Donald Trump was again sworn in as, well, this time the 47th President of the United States of America. And in 31 days from now, the citizens of our country will also elect a new German parliament, a new Bundestag. In 32 days from now, as you just mentioned, one day after that, there will be the 3rd anniversary of Russia's aggressive war against Ukraine. So, a federal electoral campaign has rarely been marked and dominated by international policies as strongly as it is this time. And that's why I'm grateful to have the opportunity to have this discussion here today on the international challenges that we are confronted with in our country in these times. In particular, I would like to outline what a German government under my leadership would do if the citizens of this country decide to give my party and myself a mandate on the 23rd of February. Ladies and gentlemen, we are confronted with tremendous challenges, which means that, first of all, we have to analyze where we are standing. So I'm going to talk very openly about, well, where we are standing in Germany and in Europe right now. The European security architecture that we have known ever since the fall of the so-called Iron Curtain in the 2+4 contract, the Budapest Memorandum, the Paris Charter, and the NATO-Russia Fundamental Act. This European security architecture no longer exists. Our own safety, our own security is not just abstract, but it is also acutely threatened by the geographically largest country in the world, which is Russia. The Russian war on Ukraine is therefore not only what we call a Zeitenwende, a turn of, well, the change of the time, as the Federal Chancellor called it in his speech on the 27th of February in 2022. No, this war is really ushering in a new era. And that's why it will be one of the central tasks of the new German government to make sure that the European Union does not only try to survive this beginning of a new era, but that it even, well, comes out of this phase in a stronger and more united way. the time when observers saw a linear geopolitical development that led to more and more democracies across the globe. Well, this time is over as well. We are witnessing a new era, an era where we have a new conflict between the different systems. On the one hand, we have the liberal democracies, and on the other hand, we have the anti-liberal autocracies, where our liberal and democratic model of life now has to, well, prove its value within this new global competition. And at the top of these conflicting systems, we have Russia and China. They actively, well, fight the multilateral order, the order that used to be the basis for the coexistence of the peoples of this world ever since the creation of the United Nations and the Bretton Woods institutions. Russia and China based their influence on premises of a policy of power that we in Europe hoped we had left behind long ago in history. International agreements, standards, and principles like the prohibition of aggressive wars and the principle of peaceful conflict resolutions are only applied if this is compatible with Russia's and China's striving for power. So we are now facing a situation where these countries confront the internationally accepted order based on the rule of law. And for almost 11 years, Russia has now attacked Ukraine, and on the 24th of February 2022, it escalated to become a full-fledged aggressive war. And I have to reiterate here that we admire the Ukrainian people's love of freedom that shows so much determination in order to defend itself against the neoliberalism of its larger neighbor. And on the Russian side, despite the loss of human lives and materials, there is no turnaround in sight. Putin set his country on the track of war and massively builds new weapons, not only to defend his own country. He does not only want to gain control of Ukraine, but of the entire area of what used to be the Soviet Union. And experts say it's only a matter of a few years before Russia will also be able to challenge NATO with conventional weapons. In addition to Russia, there is, well, an upcoming self-confident China that changes the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region and beyond. In this new era of conflicting systems, Beijing wants to demonstrate that autocracy is superior compared with the Western model of democracy and the market economy. China's leadership tries to gain regional control and regional dominance in order to put an end to the American influence in the Indo-Pacific region. And then China also has the objective to reunite the country with Taiwan. And that's one of the most dangerous threats that the international stability is currently facing. China, Russia, but also Iran, North Korea, and other states do not work separately and individually. On the contrary, when we look back, we can see that over the past decade, there has been an axis of autocracies that has a destabilizing effect around the globe, that tries to push away the political West, and that also tries to seize situations that are brought about by crises. What we see is an anti-liberal axis of states that want to take revenge and that want to openly fight liberal democracies. This axis of autocracies consists of countries that mutually support each other. Russia is supported with troops, ammunition, and semiconductors by the other countries. On the other hand, Russia cooperates with Iran. Until recently in Syria, it trains Hamas fighters and delivers China with cheap oil and gas. North Korea is supported by Russia and China in order to survive economically and in order to build up their military. And here we are not just talking about smaller measures to support each other, but we are talking about a strategy in order to develop a great balance there. Very soon, North Koreans will have intercontinental missiles with nuclear warheads that are able to reach mainland America. And ladies and gentlemen, with our current toolkit of foreign and security policies, we will not be able to successfully master any of these challenges. We need new foreign and security policies in order to promote our interests and our values during these times where we are about to enter a new era in human history. And these new policies are exactly what a federal government under my leadership will implement in 3 steps. First of all, we will guarantee that Germany and Europe have full ability to act on an international stage as far as security policy goes. Second, we will regain the trust of our international partners across the world. And thirdly, we will define strategic priorities and consistently put them into practice. First of all, let's talk about, well, reinstalling our own capacity to act. This means we will have to put an end to the permanent public fight within our government. It's the task of the federal chancellor to make sure that conflicting opinions within the governmental cabinet are only discussed internally, and that in the end we will speak with one voice when we defend our decisions to the outside world. The public fights of the past few years have led to a situation where neither our partners nor our adversaries knew where Germany was standing on the crossroads of international policies. And under my leadership, this is not going to be the case again. We will have clear positions, and that's not just the question of the perception or promotion of our own interests, but it's also part of our responsibility as the strongest economy within Europe and as the largest member state of the European Union. And in order to put an end to this public fight, we have to change the way we deal with each other within the cabinet. But we also need strong mechanisms and structures that will allow Germany to look for, define, and implement foreign policy positions. And let me remind you, the last fundamental change in our decision-making structures came when the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation was founded in 1961, and when the Federal Ministry for Defense became part of a defense committee in 1969. And we have to adapt our foreign security policy approach again, because we haven't done so in decades. We have to acknowledge that the structures from the 1960s are not strong enough anymore in order to face the complex challenges of our time. The diversity and interconnection of the challenges we are facing in internal and external security for the Federal Republic of Germany are completely different than they used to be 5 decades ago. Today, developments of crisis can happen very quickly and very frequently. The crisis is becoming the new normal in our foreign policy everyday life. And the international situation means we have been much more willing to take on responsibility across the world. For all these reasons, we will have a National Security Council in the Federal Chancellor's office. This council will be composed of those ministers in the cabinet that are involved in the topics of internal and external security, representatives of the federal states as well, and important politicians on a federal level. This National Security Council will serve as a basis for all important decisions made by the federal government in the fields of foreign policies, security policies, development, and European policies. For all of these questions, the federal government will find a consensus and defend that position publicly. So, the times when European partners heard conflicting responses from Berlin, depending on whether they were talking with the Chancellor's office, the Foreign Office, or individual ministers, these times will be over. In addition, the National Security Council will be the place where a strategic culture can be developed for the foreign, security, and European policies. And in that context, we will also make better use of the expertise that we have in foundations like these, the think tanks, the universities in our countries. And this also means that a federal government under the leadership of the Conservative Party will provide funds to create, posts for professors in the field of security politics at our university. And the Security Council will also collect and compile all the relevant information for the federal government in order to make sure the government can have a clear and comprehensive picture of the situation. The government will also have the responsibility to improve the European and European policy coordination. Over the past 3 years, within the European institution, more and more German participants have abstained from votes. In Brussels, they call this phenomenon the German vote. And I will put an end to this speechlessness that we are currently showing in European policies. Germany is not only responsible for promoting its own interests, but also for cohesion within Europe. If Germany remains silent, if Germany abstains from the vote, we do not only neglect our own interests, but we also do harm to the capacity to act of the entire European community. For that reason, the Federal Chancellor's office will really have a stronger voice again and be more committed in the field of the important questions of European policies. And I will also expect the cabinet members to participate in the Council of Ministers in Brussels on a regular basis. I will also not nominate anybody to become a minister in our cabinet as long as they don't speak proper English. Ladies and gentlemen, in order to restore Germany's capacity to act on an international scale, we also have to reform our development cooperation. We have a Christian concept of human beings, a Christian notion, which means that we have to support the poorest and weakest people in the world. But we also have to see development policies as a tool that we can use in order to promote our strategic interests in the world. For that reason, our development policies will be conditioned in the future. Fighting illegal migration, fighting terrorism, fighting the geopolitical influence of the axis of autocracies, and fighting corruption. And last but not least, promoting sales markets for German companies will be our new standards. To say that very clearly, a country that does not take illegal immigrants back from Germany cannot expect us to provide funds for a cooperation between the two countries. And if a country doesn't have a clear position against terrorism, it won't receive any funds from Germany either. And development assistance projects will be carried out more and more by German companies. In the future, development assistance should not only be carried out by the federal government and seen as something that happens independently from our overarching political goals. No, development assistance has to be an integral part of a foreign and economy policy that is guided by our own interests. And let me reiterate here, Africa, to us, is a continent of opportunities, with its young population, its potential for growth, and its rich culture and history. Despite the setbacks in Sahel and the sluggish process in Libya, we should not give up. We should not stop being committed there. On the contrary, we should even invest more energy and commitment to this fastest growing continent in the world, this youngest continent in the world. Under my leadership, the federal government will then also make sure we will gain the trust of our partners and allies again. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past few years, and not only since 2021, have we had this impression that foreign policy principles are somehow, well, not as seen as being as important as domestic policies. We are not clear, we're not reliable in our foreign policies. So the main principle of my government will be to say, others can rely on Germany again. We keep our promise. We make decisions, and once we've done so, we will also stick to it. Our partners and allies will again be able to count on us in the future. And what is most urgent here is to repair our relations to our two most important neighbors in Europe, which is Poland and France. A federal government under my leadership will put an end to the speechlessness between Berlin and Warsaw from day one. We will show respect for our neighbors in the East, and we will also bear in mind what our common history was, and we will show empathy. And on top of that, we will ask Poland, in the context of its current presidency in the Council, to show commitment to Europe and to take on a leadership role in Europe. So it's quite symbolic that Poland opened up its new embassy unter den Linden, just around the corner from here, not so long ago, because this is the place where our bilateral relations should take place, in the political heart of our capital city. Thank you very much for the applause. Ladies and gentlemen, now let me say a few more words about Poland. On the 17th of June 1991, Chancellor Kohl and Prime Minister Bielecki signed the German-Polish Neighborhood Agreement. And I would suggest that on the occasion of the 35th anniversary of the German-Polish neighborship agreement, we can have a German-Polish friendship agreement in order to put our bilateral, or to raise our bilateral relations to a new level. Our relations with France will also enter a new phase of innovation and deepening. Germany and France, within the European Council, sometimes currently defend completely conflicting interests, and that should be a thing of the past. I'm absolutely determined to use the final 2 years of the presidency of President Emmanuel Macron in order to cooperate with him and to, well, put the vision of a united Europe into practice together with him. So when I become Chancellor, I will travel to both Warsaw and Paris in order to discuss with Prime Minister Donald Tusk and with President Macron about clear initiatives that we are going to implement. And we will also strengthen our relations to Israel. I will put an end to, well, what is more or less an export embargo under the current government. We will say that whatever Israel needs to exercise its right to self-defense, they will get. And we will have state reason again, that we will also show not only in words but also in our deeds. It has to be very clear again that Germany is not in a position somewhere in between. No, Germany stands very clearly by the side of Israel, and there won't be any doubt about that in the future. So becoming reliable partners again, that is important to us. And when I talk about our partners, I do not only talk about the larger European member states, but also the smaller ones. My concept of a successful European policy in Germany is characterized by my time that I spent in the European Parliament and by the European legacy that, in particular, Helmut Kohl left behind. One of the biggest strengths of Germany within Europe has always been to integrate smaller and medium-sized member states as well, in Brussels and in Strasbourg, and, well, to act as, well, a representative of these smaller member states' interests as well. That's a good European policy tradition we have in Germany, and I will return to that tradition. Our partners in the Indo-Pacific region also need a sign that our idea of cooperation is not just to have a ship traveling through their region now and then. Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand, our allies in this geostrategically important region of the world should know that we will make an active contribution to stability and freedom in that region. That's why I suggest the creation of a permanent European marine basis in the Indo-Pacific region. And in our discussion, we can talk a bit more about this region. But last but not least, we should also, focus more on the Arabian Peninsula and the Gulf states. They want to cooperate with Germany, and they have the feeling that they are not sufficiently perceived by us. I often hear of investment programs that never happen in the end because Berlin is not interested. I want to, come to a more active diplomacy with these states. This means we have to extend the Abraham Accords regionally. We need new partnerships in the fields of energy, technology, and investments in a general sense. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me move on to the third step we're going to take if our party can, form the government, and that's implementing geostrategic priorities. Because the problem is, over the past 3 years, Germany has not really defined any geostrategic priorities. The national security strategy was a good step, but still it lags behind. It does not do what would be needed, because what we say, we are in favor of everything that's good in the world, multilateralism, international order, and putting an end to hunger, sustainability goals, reforming the United Nations, and so on. And of course, all of these goals are correct, but we have to define a hierarchy, a ranking, because otherwise we won't be able to implement any of that with our limited financial and diplomatic means. So a national security strategy, first of all, has to define priorities. Then we have to take stock of our resources. And as a third step, we have to define concrete measures. And that's why the National Security Council will first of all create a new, extended, revised national security strategy. During my first year, I want to present a new national security strategy that is really up to the challenges of our time, that defines priorities, that realistically describes the resources that we have, and that will then also define concrete action that will be binding for the entire federal government. I think our three strategic priorities are, first of all, restoring our ability to defend ourselves. Secondly, restoring our capacity to act within Germany and Europe. And thirdly, to put an end to the Russian war on Ukraine. Now, the most important and urgent strategic priority here is to restore our ability of defense and deterrence. And the leitmotif, the motto here will be, we want to be able to defend ourselves to make sure we don't even have to. So investing in our overall capacity of defense is a decisive investment we have to make in order to protect our freedom and peace in Europe. Because the most important lesson we can learn from the younger European history is strength scares aggressors away. Weakness invites aggressors. And I want Germany and Europe to be strong, with strong military, with strong civilian defense, and with a resilient infrastructure. And in the beginning of February, the European heads of government will meet to discuss, well, our capacity to defend ourselves. The new Defense Commissioner Kubilius, whom I met in Brussels not so long ago, suggested, well, the creation of a European Defense Fund. Well, the idea is to have a three-digit billion euro fund where we can either borrow money on the capital market or, well, we can also, well, get contribution payments from the member states for that. Now, ladies and gentlemen, of course, there's a big need to put the European defense system onto new feet, to have, well, our own defense industry. Now, that is the strategic interest of Europe. We have to be able to defend ourselves, and we need the necessary equipment for that. But I have doubts. If the reasons for our lack of, well, defense can be forged just with money. If we want to use money effectively, if we want money to show an effect, then first of all, we need to fundamentally reform the European and also the national procurement of arms. So I think we have to focus on three aspects here: simplification, standardization, and scale. I call them the three S's. Let me give you a few examples. The European NATO member states currently develop and produce 178 weapons systems. The United States, only 30. Europe currently has 17 different tanks. The US, 1. And 29 different types of warships. Now, we have lots of redundancies, obviously, that cost a lot of money and waste a lot of potential. I want Made in Europe to be a label of quality and quantity, also in the field of our defense policies. And I want us to be on the same level as the US. But as long as we don't dedicate ourselves to simplification, standardization, and the scale as well, I think that funds financed by the member states or borrowing money is not the right solution. In short, we need a real European domestic market for defense equipment as well. And then another, or the third strategic priority, putting an end to the Russian war on Ukraine. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me say very clearly that we all want peace as quickly as possible. I personally don't know anybody who wouldn't want that. And there's no doubt about it. In Germany, we want peace. So the political discussions we're having revolve around two entirely different questions. First of all, what kind of peace do we want? And secondly, what do we have to do for that in order to restore peace in Europe? Let me start with the first question. What kind of peace do we want? And Mr. Paulsen, you already said this during the introduction. The war that we want is a war in security and freedom. We don't want a war based on, well, the suppression exercised by an imperialist power. We don't want peace at the expense of our freedom. No, we want a freedom in peace and security that allows us to sustain our way of life, our democracy, and our liberal society. And for Ukraine, I have the impression that the most important answer is they have to win the war. And when I say win the war, this means restoring the territorial integrity whilst exercising their state's sovereignty on the basis of a democratically legitimized government. Winning the war also means for Ukraine that they have the full freedom to choose the political and also military alliances that they want to enter. And by the way, this is what was assured to them in the Paris Charter in 1990, also by the Soviet Union, and also in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. This was guaranteed to Ukraine by Russia. And that many people don't remember that, but that is the only reason why Ukraine back then gave up its considerable nuclear weapons arsenal. Some of it was destroyed, but most of it was handed over to Russia back then. And this disarmament is what Ukraine has to pay for today, because now they are caught up in a war that threatens the very existence of this state. And that's why Russia must not see any chance anymore to successfully continue this war with their military. And my impression during these past few days is that the new American government also sees it the same way, at least in part. Now, all of this means Ukraine has to be strong enough to defend itself effectively against this Russian aggression. And ladies and gentlemen, this is clear now, but it has to remain clear as well. Germany must still not become a party in this war. So, we have to support Ukraine with all the diplomatic, financial, humanitarian, and also military means that we have in order to help them exercise their right to defend themselves. Now, one remark here. For this reason, I am convinced that the only viable path towards peace and security in Ukraine is, well, by continuing to support them consistently. There must be no doubts about the path that we want to go down together. And that's something I also told President Zelensky when I met him in person for the third time on Tuesday night, well, on the occasion of the World Economic Forum in Davos. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about strategic priorities, I also have to talk about the ability to have a strategy. The problem is, and it has often been described, that in Germany we lack a strategic culture. And in fact, in central fields of foreign and security policies, we can see many examples of that. First of all, the Middle East conflict. If you ask people about the strategy that we have in Germany to solve the Middle East conflict, the answer is always the same. They always say, we want a two-nation solution, a two-state solution. But that is not a strategy. It only is an objective. But the question is, how do we get there? How do we want to achieve this objective? And nobody talks about that. A second example is Iran. The nuclear agreement with Iran failed because it did not count on, well, a tough position, but it was based on, well, the belief in a goodwill of a dictatorship. We still say we don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons, but we don't have any strategy to get there. So this new era, this tremendous change in the world is very serious, and that's why we can't accept a situation where we don't have any strategy. The ability to have strategies means that in the important foreign and security policy aspects, we need to shape policies. We are currently a sleeping power in Europe, and we have to become a leading power. And the National Security Council will also make a contribution to that objective. To come to an end, ladies and gentlemen, let's also say a few words about our relations to the US of A. Our relations to the US have always been and continue to be of utmost importance for the security, freedom, and prosperity in Europe. As far as I am concerned, I am grateful and satisfied that the strongest economy and the strongest military power in the world is a democracy and not an autocracy, and that together we are part of a collective defense alliance. There is no other partnership in the world that would have the same depth, the same shared interests, the same shared values as the partnership between Germany and Europe on this side of the big pond and the US on the other side of the Atlantic. So these ties across the Atlantic have, well, been firm and robust so far, regardless of the administration that we had in the White House. Over the past few days, I said that against the backdrop of, well, the new president in the White House, we should not be afraid, but we should do our homework in Europe first. When we want to be taken seriously in Washington, then we as Europeans have to make sure that we are, for example, able to take on the responsibility for our own security. Germany and Europe have been, well, protected and have benefited from America's pledge to protect us for 75 years. But now we have to make a bigger contribution to our own security. We can't rely on others to save our problems. And that's why I think Donald Trump's presidency is also a chance for Europe to strengthen itself. And as far as trade goes, trade policies, we have to avoid a spiral of tariffs, of increasing tariffs, because that would only make both Europeans and Americans poorer. That's why a government under my leadership would suggest to have a positive agenda to connect our economic areas even closer. And I don't give up the hope to have a transatlantic free trade agreement one day. Currently, at least, we have to regret the fact that TTIP was not put into practice back then. So we should try it again to implement a transatlantic free trade agreement to the benefit of both sides. But of course, when we talk about transatlantic relations, we often talk about the past. It's often nostalgia. We look back to the history of the Cold War, the airlift, the Marshall Plan, Kennedy and his speech at the Schöneberg Rathaus, Ronald Reagan at the Brandenburg Gate. Ladies and gentlemen, these historic events were, of course, the basis for the German-American relations. But let's be honest, historic nostalgia doesn't help us in the present. We have to further develop our partnership with the US in a pragmatic way, without romanticism, and with a clear understanding also of our own interests. Now, this also means we don't have to teach each other's lessons. When we talk about foreign policies, the idea cannot be to shape the world the way we want it to be. No, foreign policy means we have to identify common interests, overcome differences, and also accept the fact that sometimes we disagree. We have to accept the fact, for example, that Donald Trump and the Republican Party were voted by the American voters with a very strong majority. So we should not lament about that, but we should define our own interests instead. And last but not least, when we talk about our transatlantic relations, this of course also includes the Southern Atlantic. The free trade agreement between the European Union and Mercosur really has to be put into practice now. As Europeans, we can't afford to, neither on a geostrategic nor on an economic level, to keep discussing about such a free trade agreement for years and years. In Brussels, I will work to make sure that in the future there will be EU-only agreements that really focus on the core, on the most important part, which is promoting trade. And in this context, I would like to reiterate that the strategic foreign and economy policy is much more than just trade policies. At the core, we need a German globalization policy that is based on our many national interests that quite often, not always, but quite often, are also the European interests. To come to an end, ladies and gentlemen, rarely in the younger history of our country have we been confronted with such transformative challenges as we are today, also in the field of foreign and security policies. But I believe that we have every opportunity in these new eras, in these new times, not only to survive these changes, but also to be much more united, to stand much closer within the European Union, because we are in the European Union. Unfortunately, the UK no longer is a member of the European Union, but I would also include the UK here. So within the European Union and beyond, we have much more than 450 million citizens. We are an area of shared values and interests, of a shared history and culture, deeply rooted in a democratic tradition and the principle of the rule of law. So these commonalities are the basis and the reason why Europe has so far been able to protect its freedom, peace, and stability. Also, in these times of an increasing competition between the different systems. And we all have to fight for that. It's definitely worth the effort. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Vielen Dank, lieber Herr.
Thank you, Mr. Merz. In a bit more than 35 hours, you traveled the world. That was really interesting. Thank you very much for taking the time to answer our questions here on stage and also with the audience. By the way, one remark to the live stream audience. Of course, you can also ask questions for Mr. Merz. If you want to do this, please use X, the platform, #KGLDMerz. Should be used by you. We will collect the questions, and I will then ask some of the questions to Mr. Merz on your behalf. But let us start here on stage. Have you ever traveled to Greenland, Mr. Merz? I didn't expect this question. Yeah, this is why I'm asking you. Well, let me give you a very honest answer. I once, from Europe, and once from the US, flew there myself. And this part of the world I saw from two different angles. Firstly, from Ilulissat, and secondly, from Narsarsuaq. Have you ever been there? No, I haven't been there myself, but I'm not a flying Saarland citizen like you are. But I wanted to start with Greenland, Mr. Merz, because in these days and weeks, we have heard a lot about Greenland, also because since Monday, a person has been in the White House that stands for America first, and he is obviously willing to give up basic principles of the rule-based international order, maybe also of liberal democracy. And this is why at the beginning of our discussion, I would like to talk about the West as an idea, not as a direction, and maybe as a counterdraft to what you called the axis of autocracies earlier in your speech. I was asking myself whether in times of transatlantic relations focused on transactional deals, this is what we hear a lot these days. So the foundation of values, the partnership of values in the transatlantic partnership is kind of getting lost, it feels. So are we now able to really rescue the West as an idea or a concept? Well, you just said it yourself. The West is not a direction. It is not a geographical description. The West is a normative foundation that we are all built on. And I assume that this includes the United States of America as well. Donald Trump, in his speech on Monday and also before that, made a few announcements: the Gulf of Mexico, the Panama Canal, Greenland, he mentioned. He said that he wants to defend America's interests and he wants to expand America's interests also in terms of new territories. The renaming of the Gulf of Mexico into Gulf of America will be a minor issue. The Panama Canal is a bigger issue and Greenland might become the biggest challenge. But we have to know the following. The Americans, for decades, have been present on Greenland with a huge air base, which internationally is used for purposes of national and international defense. It's also used as an airport for transatlantic aviation. And I am totally convinced that Donald Trump, regarding his interest in Greenland, will not play it off against the territorial interests and not against the interests of the European Union, including Denmark. But how he does it, I mean, sheds light now on a region of this world which is of utmost geopolitical significance. It's Greenland, it's the South and the North Poles. And by the way, it is also the airspace and the space in general. So this opening of our perspective is now happening, and this is his first merit. How this develops is something that we should discuss with him. And until we prove the opposite, I assume that the US will play by the rules and will defend Denmark's territorial integrity, and major parts of Greenland belong to Denmark, some parts to Canada, and I assume that the US administration will respect this. If not, we have to talk to him. I think he will play by the rules, but it is his method to open perspectives and angles. And you can see with our discussion that he has been successful. If in his inauguration speech on Monday he said, yeah, I would like to become a bit more active on Greenland, then we wouldn't have discussed it here, would we? Yeah, that would have been a pity. Well, Mr. Merz, he does not only open our perspective, but he confronts us with facts. Paris Climate Agreement, WHO. What do you think about these steps? Well, this is nothing new, yet it is, of course, disconcerting. It is not new because even during his first administration, and Joe Biden, by the way, didn't change it, he questioned the functioning of international organizations. Let me give you the example of the WTO. Since Trump's first term, the WTO is not working anymore for the following reason. The appointment of judges in the respective bodies was blocked by Trump, and Biden didn't change this. Under Joe Biden, there were no appointments, no consents regarding the appointment of judges into the respective bodies of the WTO. It is the withdrawal of the US from international institutions. I just mentioned them, the post-war institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions. And let's wait and see what is going to happen. Of course, it's disconcerting and concerning. The Paris Agreement without the US will become a particularly big challenge, which doesn't mean that we will not stick to this goal. We will look for other allies on this planet, and I'm totally sure that in the US there will be domestic discussions about this approach. Look at Los Angeles. Whether you see direct causality or not is something that I'm not going to judge now, but that climate change is also affecting the US is something that we definitely know, and then there will be this discussion in the US. So let us discuss this with the US, is my suggestion. What we also have to discuss with the US is defense expenses. Now, recently you said that we in Germany, for the next 3 to 4 years, we should reach the 2% goal. And then in the whole of Europe, we have to focus on efficiency gains, and you also reiterated this in your speech. Now, in NATO, the discussion is going to a totally different direction. They are talking about 3% now, and this is the lowest level, they say, in NATO. I think the next NATO summit will happen in The Hague in June. And in case that you will be Germany's next chancellor, what will be your position then in The Hague? The current resolution passed by NATO is a minimum of 2%. Mark Rutte now suggested 3 or 3.5%. Trump threw 5% into the debate. I don't put anything into perspective. We definitely have to do more for our own defense. But honestly speaking, I don't think that throwing numbers makes a lot of sense. We have to achieve the 2% goal first and foremost. This is a huge effort. We are lagging 30 to 40 billions of euros behind. And after that, we have to do more. But I want a different priority when it comes to these issues. The necessary funds that we earmark, and this has to be more than 2%, are necessary. The necessary funds have to be spent much more effectively. We can get more for our money. That said, the procurement system has to be changed. I mentioned the 3 S's in my speech, and I particularly want to focus on the first 2. Simplification and standardization, that is. Our procurement and our machines and structures are way too complex, and this particularly applies to Germany. Let me give you an example, which for totally different reasons is currently being discussed, maybe even for this reason. It is the Taurus system. Now, of all missiles in this world, we have the most complicated, the most expensive, the best, and only consolidated with Sweden, high-tech system with Taurus. We have 3 or 4 other systems in the European Union. And the entire discussion about the usage of missiles in Ukraine, delivery to the Ukrainian army, and then usage there, we could simplify if we had one common system in the European Union and if we had one political decision in the EU whether we are going to deliver it to the Ukrainian army or not. This is an example that shows you that there is a connection between cost, complexity, range, unconsolidated approach within the European Union. I mean, this example shows you what it means. We have 4 to 5 systems in Europe. I talked about the combat tanks. We have 17. I talked about frigates and other machinery. Before we do not standardize and simplify our systems, I cannot just talk about money. The efficiency gains that we have to achieve have to happen before the bigger budgets. And how difficult this is to coordinate everything in Europe, we know. Mr. Merz, we are actually running out of time, so let me shed some light on other areas. You talked about Israel in your presentation. In 4 days, there will be the anniversary of the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I think you will also attend the respective event. This year, we will celebrate 60 years of German-Israeli relations, and I think it is good and important that Israel's security is the reason of state in this country. The problem of the term reason of state is that nobody really knows what this means, what is meant by this, and nobody really knows what this reason of state means with regards to other values like international law. Very difficult case is the arrest warrant issued by the ICC in The Hague. We, as a member state of the Statute of Rome, are obliged to execute this arrest warrant. Hence my question for you, Mr. Merz. Which is more important, the reason of state or the compliance with international law? Well, I have intensively dealt with this issue for quite some time, also my team. And we have come to the conclusion that in terms of international law, a majority of international law experts believe that the ICC, also upon the resolution of the prosecutor, or the motion of the prosecutor, has made a formally correct decision. But I would like to take the political perspective on things and say the following. From my perspective, it is inconceivable that a minister-president, a prime minister from Israel, can no longer visit Germany or other countries in the European Union because he might run the risk of being arrested here. This is inconceivable for me. That said, we will have to look for solutions and ways how to avert this. What is agreed on in the Statute of Rome, from my personal perspective, is very difficult to apply to democratic states who have democratic governments. Originally, it focused on authoritarian state, on leaders like Milosevic and others, who basically led their own countries by committing horrendous crimes. So it is a very difficult path in terms of international law, but politically speaking, also as regards the 2 years that you have mentioned, or the 2 events that you have mentioned, 80th anniversary, NATO, up to the 27th of January, liberation of Auschwitz. It is inconceivable for me that a democratically elected head of Israel is no longer invited to Germany. And I will make everything possible. I will make sure that this will be averted and that this is not going to happen. I will not accept such a situation. Last question for you, Mr. Merz. We haven't really talked about a big, difficult country, that is China. So if a German federal chancellor travels to China, then they often ask who is part of the delegation traveling with the federal chancellor. Let's assume that you will be the next federal chancellor. What would your delegation traveling to China look like? Who would be in the delegation? Well, probably it's going to be a work visit. And the composition of the delegation is not really relevant in this context. The question is, which conversations will you have and what will be the goals of the conversations, and how can relations to China be redefined, and how can they be put on a tangible foundation or leave them on a tangible, robust foundation. I have just sketched my assessment of China, where China stands in this epochal watershed moment. My feeling tells me, also based on my knowledge of the country, that the economic situation in China is more difficult than we perceive it from the outside. The conflicts in the Communist Party have not been dissolved. They are suppressed at best, and the country is not in the situation and constitution that the Chinese media often communicate. So we are not confronted with a country or a head of China who is free from concerns and problems, who is not in an undisputed position of power. Taiwan will, of course, play a role, but I think political talks will be necessary first and foremost. I tell all representatives of the German economy, the decision to invest in China is a very risky decision. Small and medium-sized enterprises are experiencing this in particular at the moment, that are not really being focused on, but the bigger ones also experience this. This is not a state governed by the rule of law. So there will be upheavals if you invest in China, we tell them. And if you accept this risk, and I talked to a whole host of small and medium-sized enterprises and also big enterprises, they asked me for my assessment. I told everybody the same. If you accept this risk, then accept it in a way that it will not have an impact on the entire group should this investment fail, should you have to write it off. And make sure that you don't approach the German government to bail you out in an economic dire situation. And I'm using the opportunity to say this one more time. This is not an option. We will not bail out companies that accept the risk to invest in China. And there are good reasons for companies to invest in China. So if companies say, yes, we will accept the risk, it is okay, but we will not bail them out. We're not going to do this. So this is my warm request to all enterprises, no matter whether they will be part of our delegations or not. Please limit the risk that you accept to avert the damage of the company if you have to write off investments immediately. Clear announcement, ladies and gentlemen. You can prepare yourselves now for questions for Mr. Merz. Now, I have a last question for you. We talked about many difficult, complex issues. Now I have a light and easy question for you. I would like to ask you to complete the following sentence. Flying Saarland people who love coasters should play a bigger role in international politics because, well, bigger role than Flying Dutchman would be kind of a fun answer. So my personal hobby and my personal origin have not really a lot to do with my plans for the future. What is important is my long-year political experiences, and I tried to share them with you. I had many experiences in the European Parliament that really shaped me those 5 years, but also my experience outside of politics are relevant to me. I know that I'm trying to do is something that is kind of unique in party politics in Germany, but this is exactly why I'm doing this. Thank you very much for that, Mr. Merz.
Meine Damen und Herren, Sie wissen.
Ladies and gentlemen, you know what comes next. It's your turn. Please briefly introduce yourself, and please don't remember that you ask questions. Every question should end with a question mark. The first question I have seen is posed by Kira Finkel. You have the floor. And please use a microphone. Kira Finkel, German Society for foreign politics. What are your climate foreign policy goals with regards to growing security risks due to climate change in the Indo-Pacific region and in the Sahel zone? If I may say that, you have put your question into the right overall context. Climate-related issues have to do with security. This is why climate policy has to be part of a security political strategy. It has to be an integral part of our foreign policy. And we have just talked about the United States that announced that they will leave the Paris Climate Agreement. It will become very difficult to compensate for that. We as Germany, but also as the European Union, should make sure that this topic stays on top of our agenda. And it should not be overwhelmed with ideology, but with technology. This should be our response. And I'm totally convinced that we in Europe can do much, much more to solve this problem together, technologically speaking. Let me give you an example. The approval of CCS and CCO at a European level and the development of technologies at a European level, both, not just CCS, carbon capture and storage, but also the utilization CCU. I mean, we have to do and develop this together. It seems to be one of the big opportunities that we have. I think that technically speaking, it is a discussion of opportunities and not so much a discussion of risks if we do it right. And I would like to change the mindset of people. The climate issue is a huge challenge for us, but every challenge also has opportunities. And if we use these opportunities, then we can develop technologies that will not just be used in Germany and Europe, but across the entire world. And I think we should use this opportunity. Thank you. Now I have to decide who can go next, because I can see so many questions. I think Stefan Exokreis should go next now. The microphone is coming. Stefan Exokreis, European Director of the NGO One. Thank you very much, Mr. Merz. It is good to hear that Africa is seen as a continent of opportunities in your party manifesto. Thank you for highlighting it here again. I can totally agree with this. If you take a look at economic developments, demographic developments in many states, then this is definitely a continent of opportunities. And I also think that if we manage to strike a partnership with Africa that really serves the interests of both continents, that is Africa and Europe, then it will be relevant and crucial for Germany's and Europe's future. I think when it comes to shaping this partnership, the German development cooperation is decisive. It is a very important pillar of German international policy. You commented on it, made me very happy. And I would like to know a little more from you in terms of what is your vision for German development cooperation, and also what the embedding of Germany in international architecture is, and also the sustainable funding of this political area. Well, in my speech, I tried to say more than just a few sentences. Let me be a bit more specific regarding Africa. Let me just give you one example that is kind of 40 years ago. I spent some time in South Africa when I was a lawyer right after university, and I tried to understand the continent from the south. And South Africa is not Africa, for sure. I have traveled there a few times. I have been on the continent. I don't know every country, but I know a few African countries. They are very diverse. They are not the same. Also, the Organization of African States is not representative for the African continent, so we have to cooperate with individual countries. But we should always do this, referring to four different things: economic cooperation with security, with economic, and with defense policy. And I'm very, very concerned when I look at how active China is on the continent. We haven't done anything against their activities as yet, but there's also good, bad news, or bad, good news. What China has done with its Silk Road project has not really become the big success that China was hoping for, especially regarding the Chinese continent, but also in the Indo-Pacific area. There have been major disappointments regarding the Silk and Belt Initiative, also the instruments that they used, also the way how they pre-funded infrastructure projects, how they assumed debt. So things happened that give us a late opportunity to do something, to establish a fair partnership with individual states, with individual groups of states, and to also invite German companies to invest more on the African continent. And if I include the Arabic Peninsula, it has a border with the continent. And again, our economic cooperation has to be deepened. We need to forge energy partnerships. Everything is correct, but here's one comment of recent times. It was reported on this week. I spent 2.5 days in Davos. And Tuesday night, I had a chance to talk to a whole group of American and Arabic entrepreneurs. They very critically watch the situation in Europe, and they say, if you continue this regulation, and they mentioned the Supply Chain Act and the reporting obligation, CSRD, they said, don't delay. Don't delay the adoption for 2 years, but dissolve them. If you keep them, we will not come, they said. So this entire image, and it's not just a small excerpt, it's the entire image, looks as follows. We in Europe have to make some decisions that will be very hard and that will correct what we deemed correct in the last years. And this includes guidelines like the CRD reporting and the Supply Chain Act, etc. Investors of these countries will not be willing to comply with these rules of the European Union. Therefore, I'm absolutely determined to do everything that these rules will not be adopted and come into force. Only then will we make progress with all these different countries on the African continent, in the Arabic Peninsula, and beyond this. They are watching us very, very closely and very, very critically, much more critically than we perceive this. And this is why quite a few things have to be fundamentally corrected.
Wir haben jede Menge Fragen.
Okay, I think we have time for 2 more questions, if that's okay. Yeah? Okay, great. Well, then let's do that. Yeah, 2 short questions, 2 short answers. Okay, very good. Now, there's one question that came from one of our online audience, from one of our online viewers. It's a very short question, really, that says, in your speech, you didn't really say anything about your position on EU enlargement. Yes, no, it's hard to give you a short answer to that question, but first of all, I regret the fact that the European Union has shrunk. The fact that the UK left the European Union is a strong strategic setback, both for the UK and for us. Now, the enlargement of the European Union will take quite a while. We are talking about the countries in the Western Balkans here, Ukraine and other countries as well. I joined the European Parliament and spent 5 years there at a time when there was an institutional connection to the European Union that used to be called EFTA. And the countries, the EFTA countries, they formed the European Economic Area together with the European member states. So part of the acquis communautaire of the European Union was transferred to the EFTA states back then. Now, the EFTA doesn't really play a big role nowadays because it hardly has any members anymore. Liechtenstein, Switzerland and Norway, that's all. But what I also said in my discussion with Mr. Macron is that we have to come up with an idea in order to make sure that we no longer have this clear distinction between, well, being either a complete member or being no member at all. So we should invent something that sits somewhere in between, that opens up the path towards membership, that allows countries to participate in the European single market. Like Switzerland, you know, Schengen and the association agreement with the European Union is highly controversial in Switzerland, and I hope that the Swiss population, the Swiss citizens, will give the green light. And then the UK. In my discussions, also with Keir Starmer, I had the impression that the UK really wants to cooperate with the European Union again. And one country that also has to be our strategic focus is, of course, Turkey. Because I think that Turkey won't become a full member of the European Union anytime soon. But again, it's not a good idea to make this clear distinction between being a full member and being no member at all, because this means that we, well, create a barrier that keeps us from having a close cooperation with these countries. So I don't have a final answer to this question, but I'm somehow characterized by the EFTA structure that we used to have in the past, of these things about the concentric circles that Scholz and Lamas wrote, the concentric circles around the European Union. Like I said, I can't really come up with a final question to this answer, but I'm trying to find ways to make sure that we can really take the countries around the European Union on board more and more, so that they can also participate in the European mechanisms and decision-making structures. So that is not just 0% or 100%, but that there's also something in between, so that nobody gets the impression that these countries are second-class members, because they are not. These are members that are, or countries that are in a process, countries that may also be happy with their current status for the foreseeable future. But we need to create a connection to the European Union, to create a close ties to the European Union for these countries, even though I don't have a final answer yet. Okay, Ina here in the first row. Thank you very much, Mr. Merz. Ina Holsten. I work for the Foreign Office, but right now I just talk on behalf of myself. As a private person, or maybe a Körber-Stiftung young leader member, because we are also asked, well, a lot to ask critical questions in discussions. Thank you very much for your very interesting speech. And I'd like to pick up on two things you said. First of all, you said that you are going to unify and thereby strengthen our foreign politics again, to bundle our strengths and forces. I think that's a very good approach. And then another thing that is also mentioned in your party's agenda, humanitarian aid and development assistance. That's something that we already do, not just in the field of the military, but overall, and you want to bring these two aspects together. Now, I think it has been tried several times to unite the Foreign Office and the Ministry for Economic Cooperation, but I think this would be a good project, and there are not many alternatives. We have to do that because we're living in a world where we have two different bodies that make different decisions, conflicting decisions, and of course this weakens us. And when we say that we don't have enough funds, enough resources, we have to be efficient, and the only way is to unite these two bodies under one rooftop. Because I think even the Federal Security Council alone would not be able to do that. So I just wanted to say I agree with you on that. And a second thing, if I may, related to Israel, because you said you want to do whatever you can to make sure we can freely export weapons and that we can support Israel in its fight against terrorism. Now, provided that Israel is currently in a fight against the terrorism and Hamas, which is a very brutal terrorist organization. And of course, Germany plays a very special role. We are a very, very close partner for Israel, and of course, we have to support them, of course. On the other hand, you can also see that, and this is really quite scary, that this fight over the past 2 years has hardly yielded any results. Sorry for speaking so long when it's such a complicated topic. That's why I need to talk a little bit more. So there is information suggesting that Hamas is as strong as it used to be in the very beginning, when you think about its manpower in Gaza. Now, that is very scary, of course, but this also shows that the purely military approach didn't yield any results. In the approach of protecting people, the integrative approach, we have seen lots of civilians die, lots of casualties, lots of human rights that were violated. And as Israel's closest partner, I think we have the obligation to cooperate with the country and with the Israeli government to find a better approach. And I hope that with all this pressure that is made from all different sides internationally, I think that this pressure also leads to a situation where human rights sometimes get lost. Quite a lot of this is really transactional and just focused on the results. But of course, Germany has a strong voice and is an advocate, well, here in this process, also based on its history. So that was just something I wanted to say. It's more like a statement. And I would like to say thank you for everything you said in your speech. Thank you. Well, as regards your first question, yes, this is something we can think about. I didn't really want to answer any organizational questions today, but political questions. I wanted to ask political questions and also try to answer organizational questions. But what you just said might be the final organizational solution. But the important is that we have a new approach, that we tackle these questions in a new way. So as far as this question is concerned, yes, I am also open to the solution that you have just outlined. Thank you very much, Mr. Merz. So we are ending on a, well, reflective, thoughtful note. Obviously, there's a need for more discussion, so you're welcome to come back one day. Thank you very much for this interesting and exciting talk. Thank you all in the audience for your presence and for listening to us so actively. I'd also like to say thank you to the team of the Körber Foundation and the Beisel and Mathieu agency that really helped us tremendously in organizing all of this. Now, you are all invited to stay with us a bit longer, maybe have a glass of wine, and let's talk a bit more and think a bit more about the things we've just heard. Thank you very much.